I will just say that the people have been speculating and saying, well, why didn't Beyonce get in the middle? In my mind, Beyonce didn't get in the middle because Solange was probably attacking him over something that he knows he was wrong about. And therefore, sister didn't get in the middle.
Now, by now, many of you have seen the footage of me and Solange in the elevator.
We released a joint statement saying that this is all behind us, but we wanted to tell you in person.
How much younger is she?
She's 5 years, but I'm very protective, and I always treated her like my baby. And one day she told us this little bully, this little guy in school, she was only about 9, was really her. So me and my girl.
And a lot of people are also saying, well, Jay-Z really held his head because, real men don't hit girls, except there's some footage online of Jay-Z hitting a female fan back in the day. Allegedly. The legal team is up there going crazy with the alleged button. The bodyguard to Beyonce stopped the elevator in the middle of going down. They were exiting the party, so they were on their way out to the paparazzi to get in the car and stuff. So stopped the elevator, and the fight went on. And I guess the security guard, look, Beyonce and the security guard were standing there like this is nothing new.
Something just shifted, and people are starting to notice. Out of nowhere, old footage is back in circulation. Timelines are lighting up again, and one name keeps getting pulled into the center of it all: Beyonce. But this time, it's not about music, not about performances, not even about awards. It's about questions. Big ones. The kind that don't go away once they're asked. Because suddenly, people aren't just looking at what's happening now, they're going back, rewatching, reanalyzing, trying to understand moments that once felt random, but don't feel random anymore. And right in the middle of all that, the infamous elevator incident involving Solange Knowles and Jay-Z, a moment the world thought it had already moved past. But what if that moment meant more than anyone realized? That's the question that's starting to take over the conversation. Because with new rumors circulating, resurfaced interviews, and people connecting dots that were ignored for years, the narrative is shifting fast. And not everyone is comfortable with where it's going. Some are saying this is just another cycle of internet speculation, old stories being dragged back into the spotlight for clicks and attention. But others? They believe something deeper might be hiding beneath the surface. That maybe certain things were never fully explained, just quietly moved past. And then there's the silence. No clear statements. No direct responses. Just a growing wave of conversation that seems to be getting louder by the hour. And in situations like this, silence doesn't calm things down. It raises more questions. Because now people aren't just asking what happened back then. They're asking what was known and what was never said. And trust me, once you start looking at the timing, the resurfaced clips, and the way the story is evolving right now, you're going to start wondering one thing. Is this just rumors spiraling out of control? Or is something finally coming back into the light? Before the current wave of rumors, before the timelines filled up again, and before people started rewatching old clips with a completely different mindset, there was already a story that the world thought it understood. Because when you hear the names Beyonce and Jay-Z, you're not just thinking about two celebrities. You're thinking about one of the most powerful and carefully built images in modern entertainment. For years, they've represented more than just music. They've been seen as a brand, a symbol of success, control, and near perfection in an industry where that kind of image is almost impossible to maintain. From the outside, everything always looked aligned. Massive tours, billion-dollar business moves, carefully timed public appearances, and a level of privacy that made them feel untouchable. They weren't just part of the culture, they shaped it. And because of that, the public didn't just watch them, it believed in them. But here's the thing about an image that's strong. The stronger it looks on the surface, the more people question what might be happening underneath. And that curiosity didn't start today. If you rewind far enough, there have always been moments, small at first, that didn't fully match the polished narrative. Moments that got attention, trended for a while, and then slowly faded away as new headlines took over. But one moment never fully disappeared: the elevator incident. The footage involving Solange Knowles and Jay-Z inside that elevator didn't just go viral, it became one of the most talked about celebrity moments of its time. No audio, no context, just visuals that raised immediate questions. And while a joint statement later described it as something resolved, it didn't answer the question people really wanted to know: what actually caused it? At the time, people speculated. Some thought it was personal. Others believed it was tied to something deeper behind the scenes. But without confirmation, the moment slowly shifted from headline to history. Or at least, that's what it looked like. Because now, years later, that same moment is being pulled back into the spotlight, and not in the same way it was before. This time, it's being re-examined, reinterpreted, placed into a much larger conversation that didn't exist back then. And that's where things start to change. Because the current wave of discussion isn't just about one incident, it's about patterns, about timing, about how certain stories resurface at specific moments and suddenly feel more relevant than they did before. Now add another layer to this. As conversations about industry power, influence, and behind-the-scenes dynamics have grown louder in recent years, people have started looking at older events differently. Things that once felt isolated are now being connected. Not proven, but connected enough to keep the conversation alive. And that's exactly what's happening here. Old interviews are being revisited. Past comments are being reanalyzed. Clips that were once ignored are now being watched frame by frame. And the narrative? It's no longer simple. Because instead of asking, "What happened?" people are now asking, "What did it mean?" And more importantly, was everything really as clear as it seemed? At the same time, another factor is driving this resurgence: the role of public silence. Because throughout all of this, one thing has remained consistent: controlled communication, rare interviews, limited direct responses, a pattern of addressing only what needs to be addressed, and leaving everything else untouched. For years, that approach worked perfectly. It maintained the image. It kept speculation from growing too far. It allowed them to stay ahead of the narrative without fully engaging with it. But in today's environment, silence doesn't function the same way anymore. Instead of closing conversations, it often fuels them. Because now, every unanswered question becomes a space for interpretation. Every lack of response becomes part of the story. And every resurfaced clip gains new meaning simply because it exists without explanation. That's why this situation feels different now. Because it's not being driven by one single event. It's being driven by accumulation. Years of moments, comments, and unanswered questions being brought together at once and viewed through a completely different lens. And when that happens, even the smallest detail starts to feel important. Even the oldest clip starts to feel relevant. Even the strongest image starts to feel fragile. But here's where things get even more complicated. Because not everyone sees this the same way. Some people believe this is exactly what it looks like: old rumors resurfacing, exaggerated by the internet, and being stitched together into a narrative that may not reflect reality. They argue that powerful public figures are always going to face speculation. That success at this level naturally attracts attention, criticism, and theories, especially when information is limited. And that perspective? It's completely valid. But on the other side, you have people who believe something else entirely. They see the timing of these resurfaced stories. They see the connections being made. And they start to wonder whether this is more than coincidence. Not confirmed facts. Not proven claims. But enough unanswered questions to make them look closer. And that's what keeps the conversation alive. Because when a story exists in that space, between certainty and speculation, it becomes almost impossible to ignore. You can't fully prove it, but you also can't fully dismiss it. And that's exactly where this situation is sitting right now. Right in that gray area. Where every new detail, no matter how small, feels like it could shift the entire narrative. Where every resurfaced moment adds another layer to a story people thought was already understood. And where the biggest question isn't just about the past, but about what it all means now. Because if these conversations continue to grow, if more pieces keep resurfacing, if the narrative keeps evolving, then what we're seeing right now might not just be a temporary spike in attention. It might be the beginning of a much bigger shift. And just when it feels like the background is finally clear, that's when the real conflict starts to rise to the surface. And just when people thought they were simply revisiting old moments, that's when the situation took a sharp turn into something far more intense. Because up until this point, everything felt like reflection, people looking back, rewatching clips, questioning details that were never fully explained. It was curiosity. It was speculation. It was the internet doing what it always does, connecting dots, even if those dots don't always connect. But then, the conversation shifted. It stopped being about the past and started becoming about responsibility. Because suddenly, people weren't just asking what happened in that elevator involving Solange Knowles and Jay-Z. They started asking something much heavier. Who knew what and when? And that's where Beyonce was pulled directly into the center of the storm. Now this is where things get complicated, because there's no single confirmed explanation driving this conversation. Instead, it's being fueled by a mix of resurfaced interviews, online discussions, and interpretations that people are building in real time. Some voices are suggesting that moments from the past, like that elevator incident, might have been reactions to deeper issues. Others are pushing back, saying that's a stretch, and that people are reading too much into limited information. But once that question is introduced, it doesn't go away. Because now, every old clip gets re-examined through a different lens. Every interview is replayed with new assumptions. Every silence feels louder than it did before. And that's when the conflict truly begins. On one side, you have people defending Beyonce strongly. They argue that there's no verified evidence supporting the more extreme interpretations. That revisiting old events and attaching new meanings to them, without clear proof, can distort reality. They point out that high-profile figures often choose privacy over constant public explanation, and that silence doesn't automatically imply hidden knowledge. And honestly, that argument holds weight. But on the other side, there's a growing group that isn't convinced. They're not necessarily claiming certainty, but they're questioning patterns. Why did certain moments get downplayed so quickly? Why do some events feel unresolved even years later? Why do certain narratives seem to reappear at specific times? And most importantly, why does it feel like there's always more being implied than actually explained? And that's where the first major twist hits. Because what if this isn't about uncovering something new? What if it's about reinterpreting something old? Think about it. The elevator footage didn't change. The public statements didn't change. The timeline didn't change. But the context? That's what's shifting. Because in today's environment, where audiences are more skeptical, more analytical, and more aware of how narratives can be shaped, old moments don't stay frozen in time. They evolve. They get re-examined. They get reframed. And sometimes, they take on entirely new meanings. So now, the same footage that once looked like a private family dispute is being viewed by some as something more layered, not proven, not confirmed, but interpreted differently enough to keep the conversation alive. And that shift? That's powerful. Because once people start questioning context, They don't stop at one moment. They expand outward. And that's exactly what's happening. Now the focus isn't just on that elevator. It's on the broader environment. The circles. The connections. The idea that high-level industries operate with dynamics the public doesn't always see. Again, not as confirmed facts, but as questions. And those questions are spreading. But here's where things get even more intense. Because as this debate grows louder, something else becomes impossible to ignore. The role of perception. Because right now, two completely different narratives are forming, both using the same information. One narrative says, "This is a case of the internet overanalyzing old events and building theories without solid evidence." The other says, "This is a situation where old events are finally being looked at more carefully, and questions that were once ignored are now being taken seriously." And neither side can fully shut the other down, because both are built on interpretation, not definitive proof. And that's what makes this conflict so unstable, because it doesn't have a clear resolution. It lives in that gray space where everything feels possible, but nothing is fully confirmed. Now here's the second part of the twist. And this is where things shift from what happened to why this is happening now. Because timing matters. And a lot of people are starting to notice that these conversations aren't resurfacing randomly. They're aligning with a broader trend, where audiences are revisiting past events across the entertainment industry, questioning narratives, and looking deeper into how public images are built and maintained. So now the question isn't just about Beyonce, Jay-Z, or Solange. It's about something bigger. How much of what we see is the full picture? And how much is just the part that's meant to be seen? And once that idea enters the conversation, everything becomes more complicated. Because now, it's not about proving a single claim. It's about understanding how narratives themselves work, how they're formed, how they're controlled, how they're sustained, and how, sometimes, they're challenged years later when the audience starts asking different questions. But here's the part that really drives the conflict forward. No one directly involved is clarifying anything right now. No new statements. No detailed explanations. No attempt to reshape the conversation. Just the same controlled silence that has always existed. And in the past, that silence maintained stability. But now, it's doing the opposite. Because in today's environment, silence doesn't end narratives. It expands them. It creates space. And in that space, people build their own interpretations. Some grounded, some exaggerated, some completely speculative, but all contributing to the same outcome. The story keeps growing, and growing, and growing, until it becomes something much larger than the original event itself. And that's exactly where we are right now. What started as a resurfaced clip has turned into a full-scale debate about perception, narrative, and truth. And just when it feels like the conflict couldn't get any more intense, that's when the next layer begins to reveal itself. Because the deeper people dig, the more complicated the story becomes. And what comes next? It doesn't just add to the conversation. It completely changes how people see it. And just when it seemed like the conversation had reached its peak, that's when everything escalated in a way nobody expected. Because once people moved past just rewatching old moments and started actively digging, this stopped being a simple discussion and turned into something much bigger. Timelines weren't just revisiting clips anymore. They were building connections. Old interviews, past headlines, forgotten controversies, everything started getting pulled back into the spotlight at the same time. And that's when the narrative began to feel overwhelming. Because suddenly, it wasn't just about one incident involving Solange Knowles and Jay-Z. It became about patterns. Patterns people believed they were seeing across different moments, different years, different situations. Now again, this is where things get tricky, because these patterns aren't confirmed facts. They're interpretations. But once enough people start noticing the same pattern, it begins to feel real, even if it's not proven. And that's exactly what's happening here. Because as more content resurfaced, one question kept getting louder. Why do certain stories keep coming back, and why now? That's the part that made this situation escalate. Because timing started to feel important. Why are these clips trending again now? Why are old interviews suddenly being shared again? Why are people connecting dots that weren't connected before? Some say it's just the internet recycling drama. Others believe it's something deeper, like attention cycles, where stories resurface when the audience is more likely to engage with them. And then there's a third perspective, that what we're seeing isn't random at all. It's just how narratives evolve over time when people start asking new questions. Now here's where the shocking reveal starts to take shape, not as a confirmed fact, but as a shift in how people are thinking. Because for years, the public viewed Beyonce through a very specific lens. Controlled, private, untouchable. Someone who rarely responds directly, and rarely needs to. But now, that same approach is being interpreted differently. The silence that once protected the image is now being questioned, not because silence proves anything, but because it leaves space. And in that space, people start filling in their own answers. That's the real turning point. Because the shocking reveal here isn't about a single piece of information suddenly appearing. It's about the shift in perception. The realization that the same behavior, silence, privacy, control, can be seen in two completely different ways depending on the moment. Before, it looked like strength. Now, to some people, it looks like avoidance. Before, it looked like control. Now, to others, it looks like something being managed. And once that shift happens, it's almost impossible to reverse. Because now every new detail, even small ones, gets filtered through that new perspective. A resurfaced interview? It feels more important. An old rumor? It feels more relevant. A past moment that didn't make sense before? Now it feels like it might mean something. And this is where the escalation becomes uncontrollable. Because the story is no longer being driven by facts alone. It's being driven by interpretation. And interpretation spreads faster than anything. But here's where things get even more intense. Because as this narrative grows, it starts pulling in other voices. Commentators, media personalities, people revisiting past opinions, including figures like Wendy Williams, whose older critiques are now being re-examined with fresh eyes. At the time, many of those comments were dismissed. But now, some people are looking back and asking, was she noticing something early or just speculating? And again, there's no clear answer. But the question itself keeps the conversation alive. Now here's the part that really pushes this into shocking territory. Because the more this story evolves, the less it becomes about what actually happened. And the more it becomes about what people believe happened. That's a huge difference. Because once belief takes over, facts become secondary. Perception becomes reality. And in that kind of environment, even uncertainty becomes powerful. Because uncertainty keeps people watching, keeps people talking, keeps people engaged. And that engagement, it fuels the entire cycle. Now here's the final layer that makes this situation even more unpredictable. Because right now, there's no clear resolution, no confirmed explanation, no definitive answer that settles the debate. And that means one thing. This story can keep evolving indefinitely. Every new clip can restart the conversation. Every new comment can shift the narrative again. Every new interpretation can create a completely different version of the story. And that's why this feels so intense. Because it's not just a story anymore. It's a moving narrative. one that changes depending on who's watching it and how they're interpreting it. So the real shocking reveal isn't a single hidden fact suddenly coming to light. It's the realization that the story itself has outgrown its original moment. It's no longer just about that elevator. It's no longer just about past rumors. It's about how narratives are built, reshaped, and amplified over time. And once you see that, you start to understand why this situation feels so much bigger now than it ever did before. But here's the thing. Just when it feels like the story has expanded as far as it can go, that's usually when the public reaction hits its peak. And trust me, the way people are responding right now, that might be the most revealing part of this entire situation. And just when the conversation reached its most intense point, that's when the reaction started pouring in, and not quietly. Because the moment this situation around Beyonce, Jay-Z, and Solange Knowles shifted from old footage to a full-blown re-examination of the past, the internet split instantly. Not into two sides, but into multiple. On one side, you have the defenders. These are the people who see this entire situation as a classic example of the internet doing too much, taking old moments, layering them with speculation, and building a narrative that may not reflect reality. They point out that none of the most serious claims being discussed have been verified publicly, and that repeating them without confirmation can create a distorted version of events. To them, the resurfacing of the elevator incident isn't a reveal. It's just history being recycled. They also highlight something important. High-profile figures often choose privacy not because they're hiding something, but because responding to every rumor would only amplify it. And in that sense, the silence from Beyonce? They see it as intentional, but not in the way people think. Not control, just restraint. But then, there's the other side. And they're asking very different questions. This group isn't necessarily claiming certainty, but they're questioning consistency. Why do certain stories keep resurfacing? Why do some moments feel unresolved even years later? Why does it seem like every time something comes back into the spotlight, it adds another layer instead of closing the conversation? To them, this isn't about proving anything. It's about patterns. Patterns in how narratives are handled. Patterns in what gets addressed and what doesn't. Patterns in how public perception is managed over time. And that perspective? It's gaining traction. Because once people start looking for patterns, they tend to find them, whether they're meaningful or not. And that's where things get even more complicated. Because now, this isn't just a fan conversation anymore. It's moved into the industry space. Commentators, media personalities, and online analysts have started weighing in, not necessarily to confirm anything, but to interpret what's happening from a broader perspective. Some are taking a cautious approach. They acknowledge the intensity of the discussion, but emphasize the importance of separating speculation from verified information. They point out how quickly narratives can escalate when multiple unconfirmed claims are discussed together, and how that can create a sense of certainty where none actually exists. Others? They're more focused on the mechanics behind the situation. Not what happened, but how the story is evolving. They're analyzing timing, engagement patterns, how old clips resurface and suddenly gain traction again, how silence interacts with speculation. And what they're pointing out is interesting, because regardless of what's true or not, the attention itself is very real. Trending topics, viral clips, millions of people engaging with the same story at once. And in the entertainment world, that kind of attention has weight. Now here's where things take another turn. Because while the public is debating interpretation, the reaction cycle itself is becoming part of the story. Think about it. One person posts a theory. Another person responds. A third person builds on it. And before long, you have multiple versions of the same situation circulating at once, each one slightly different, each one interpreted through a different lens. And none of them fully cancel the others out. Instead, they coexist, creating a narrative that feels bigger and more complex than any single explanation. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. To some, this is a story about revisiting the past and asking new questions. To others, it's a reminder of how quickly speculation can grow when there's no clear response to anchor it. And to a third group, it's something else entirely. A reflection of how modern audiences engage with celebrity culture, less passive, more analytical, more willing to question what they see. But here's the part that really stands out. No matter which perspective people hold, everyone is still watching, still reacting, still engaging, and that means one thing. The story hasn't peaked yet. Because as long as people are divided, as long as interpretations keep evolving, as long as new angles keep emerging, the conversation keeps moving forward. And right now, it's moving faster than ever. Because every reaction, supportive, skeptical, analytical, adds another layer. Every post, every video, every comment, it all feeds into the same cycle. And that cycle, it doesn't slow down on its own. It builds until something shifts, until something changes, until something new enters the conversation. And that's exactly where we are now. Because after all the reactions, after all the debates, after all the interpretations, there's still one thing missing: clarity. And without clarity, the story doesn't settle. It escalates. And just when it feels like every possible reaction has been explored, that's when the final twist begins to take shape. Because what happens next might not just answer the questions people are asking. It might change the way they're asking them entirely. And just when it feels like every angle has been explored, every clip rewatched, every opinion debated, that's when the story takes its most unexpected turn yet. Because after all the noise, after the resurfaced footage, the commentary, the theories, people started noticing something that didn't quite fit. Not something that was said, but something that wasn't. Because for a situation this massive, this discussed, this dissected, there's one thing you would normally expect by now: a clear response. But from Beyonce? Silence. From Jay-Z? Also silence. No detailed explanation. No direct clarification. No attempt to reshape the narrative. And that silence? It didn't calm anything down. It made everything louder. Because now the conversation isn't being guided by them anymore. It's being driven entirely by the audience. And that's where the final twist begins to take shape. Because some people are starting to believe that the silence isn't just avoidance. It's strategy. Not in the sense of controlling every detail, but in understanding that sometimes saying nothing allows a story to grow on its own. Because look at what's happening right now. Millions of people are watching, reanalyzing, reposting, debating. And every single one of those actions is pushing the narrative further, without a single new statement from the people at the center of it. Now ask yourself this: what's more powerful? A direct explanation that closes the conversation, or a situation that stays open-ended, where every detail can be interpreted in multiple ways? Because one ends the story, the other keeps it alive. And right now, this story is very much alive. But here's where things get even more complicated. Because what if this silence isn't just about letting the conversation play out? What if it's about timing? Waiting for the moment when responding actually matters. Because in situations like this, timing isn't random. When something is addressed too early, it gets lost in the noise. But when it's addressed at the right moment, it resets everything. Imagine this. Out of nowhere, a statement appears. Not a full explanation, just enough to shift the conversation. That one moment, it wouldn't just continue the story. It would rewrite it. Every theory would be re-examined. Every interpretation would be questioned. Every assumption would feel uncertain again. And the narrative? It starts all over. But here's the other possibility, the one that makes this even more unpredictable. What if that moment never comes? What if the silence continues? Because that outcome might be even more powerful. Because without closure, there's no ending. And without an ending, the story doesn't fade. It loops. Every resurfaced clip becomes evidence. Every old moment gains new meaning. Every unanswered question becomes more important over time, until the line between what's known and what's assumed becomes almost impossible to separate. And that's exactly where this situation is heading. Because right now, the story isn't just about a single event anymore. It's about perception. How people interpret what they see. How narratives evolve when there's no clear answer. And how quickly something can grow once the audience takes control of it. But here's the final twist that changes everything. What if this was never about proving anything in the first place? What if the focus isn't on confirming or denying specific claims, but on understanding how stories like this exist and evolve in the public space? Because once a narrative reaches this level, where millions of people are watching, debating, and interpreting, it stops belonging to the individuals involved. It becomes something else. Something shaped by attention. Something sustained by curiosity. Something that doesn't need constant input to keep going. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. A story that started with resurfaced footage, turned into a wave of discussion, and has now become something much bigger than any single moment or explanation. And the craziest part? It's still evolving. Because all it takes is one new detail, one new clip, one unexpected moment, and everything shifts again. So now the question isn't just what happened, it's what happens next. Will the silence break? Will the narrative change? Or will this story keep growing on its own, without ever getting a clear answer? Because if there's one thing this situation has proven, it's that just when it feels like you've figured it out, that's when everything changes. So now it's your turn. After everything you've seen, everything that's resurfaced, and everything that's still unclear, what do you actually believe is going on here? Do you think this is just the internet revisiting old moments involving Beyonce, Jay-Z, and Solange Knowles, connecting dots that don't really connect? Or do you feel like there are still unanswered questions from the past that people are only now starting to look at more closely? Be real with it. Because this isn't one of those situations with a clear answer. That's why it's blowing up the way it is. Everyone is watching the same clips, but walking away with completely different conclusions. So drop your thoughts in the comments right now. Do you think this is all speculation getting out of control? Or do you believe there's more to the story that hasn't been fully explained yet? And if you notice something others might have missed, timing, reactions, patterns, bring it up. Let's break this down together, because the more perspectives there are, the more interesting this gets. If this video made you think differently, hit that like button. If you want more deep dives like this, where we don't just look at what's trending but actually analyze what's behind it, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because trust me, this story isn't over. The moment anything new drops, a statement, a clip, even a small detail, the entire conversation is going to explode again. And when it does, you're going to want to be here first.